I'd like to call the January 13th meeting of the Poet Laureate Task Force to order. Christine, please roll call
MK Sadiq.
here.
Yeah, I apologize. If you are here, please respond with present or here. Ann Hobrich, Pamela Garvey,
Here.
Kayla McCoy, Nikki Smith,
Here.
Connor Kerrigan.
Here.
You have four present. You may proceed.
Thank you so much, Christine. We don't have any minutes, so we don't have to have an approval of minutes at this time. Again, my name is MK Sadiq. Some of you might know me as MK Stallings. There's a story behind the name change. I won't bore you with that today. But what I will say is that we have a wonderful opportunity to name our next poet laureate, and I'm so glad that these task force members have are able to join us today and join us for this journey. This is going to happen fairly quickly, mainly because we want to get this done for the city of St. Louis. So I'm excited about that. I'm going to ask that each of our task force members take a moment to introduce who you are and maybe state your affiliation or interest in poetry, and we can proceed from there. I'll begin with you, Pamela.
Sure. Hi, Pamela Garvey. I've lived in St. Louis now for 25 years. And I am a poet, so that's, I guess, my connection to it. I have two chapbooks and a collection of poetry. I'm actually writing a memoir right now, so something a little bit different. I've been very involved in the poetry and the art scene in St. Louis in multiple ways with some of the local theaters as well, and with the St. Louis Poetry Center. I was the founder of Words and Purpose literary readings. So I've probably run across a lot of you at some point in some way over all these years.
Excellent. Thank you. Let's go with Dr. Nikki Smith next.
Hey, good afternoon. Dr. Nikki Smith. My friends call me Nick. I am born and raised in St. Louis. And I would say, how am I affiliated with poetry? I used to write a long time ago. I remember Friday nights at Legacy Bookstore. And then when I got out of college, I started writing and publishing for the St. Louis Black Pages. So I worked really closely with Howard and Vicki Denson and got really introduced to the St. Louis art and creative world. And so now I get to enjoy poetry like Word Up from Deja Polk and others. So very ingrained in arts and creativity here in St. Louis. I'm really, really excited about this opportunity.
So glad to have you. And how about you, Connor?
Yeah, hello. Connor Kerrigan. I am the Director of Communications for Mayor Tashara Jones. I also believe I am the only or one of the only members of the administration who has a degree in the arts. So I studied music, but in my time in school, I did get the opportunity to become a published poet through haiku. So I've got a couple haiku from 10, 15 years ago that are floating around in small books in various places. And so my connection to poetry is that I got to learn so much about it during my schooling. And just as the director of communications, I'm in love with words and language and the way that we use it. And so I'm very, very excited for the opportunity to be a part of this.
Thank you so much. Kaylin, I know that you just joined us, but I'm asking everyone to introduce who they are and their affiliation or connection to poetry. If you're able to unmute, Kaylin, I don't know if you are.
Sorry, I was having some technical
Oh, what happened?
difficulty. Okay, there we go. Hi, I'm Kayla McCoy. I've been doing poetry since I think I started competing first when I was 16. So I competed at Brave New Voices as a teen, and then I served as poet in residence at Herb Arts for a while. And so now I just will do gigs whenever I can. So I've been a poet and a poetry lover for a really long time now.
Thank you so much, Kaylin. All right. So, as you all know, we're in this process of figuring out who will be our next poet laureate. We've had wonderful poets laureate before, beginning with the inaugural poet laureate, Dr. Michael Castro, followed by the very wonderful Shirley LaFleur. And then, of course, we have Jane E. Iber. So Jane E. Iber was the last poet laureate that the task force named, and it's been quite some time since we named her. So that means that we're in the process of figuring out who the next will be. The first three almost seemed easy, given their resumes, given what they've contributed to the community. It's not very difficult to imagine how those three people could be luminaries in this process, and easy for us to kind of latch onto. But I think going forward, we'll have to figure out who is next. And I think that's our process here. So, one, I wanted to mention that this whole process started. I just want to acknowledge, really, this whole process started with a guy by the name of Aaron Williams. He's the founder of the Seventh Grade Poetry Foundation. And it was interesting because I was talking to a poet by the name of Kevin McCameron. He is a slam poet, slam poetry, slam master, as they would call it. And we had talked about the poet laureate for the region, and we had figured out, well, maybe we need to do something internally, you know. But Aaron Williams, who wasn't in that conversation, but very much so was tapped into the zeitgeist, was willing to take this to the president of the Board of Aldermen at the time to push for the naming of a St. Louis City Poet Laureate. And so I'm really excited that we're at this point, and I wanted to acknowledge the people who got us here, mainly because without their efforts, without the efforts of Aaron Williams, without the excellence of Castro, LaFleur, and Iber, we would not be able to continue on this process as we understand it today. So the particular ordinance comes from 69879. And if you were, that's actually available on the website. You can get a link to that ordinance on the website, I believe. So you'll be able to find it and look for it. One of the things that we're tasked with as a task force is to create a process, an open process to determine the nominee. Second, we'll need to come up with selection criteria. Now, the good news is that a lot of this stuff has already have been developed, right? And we can access that information again online. But as we do that and as we consider it, we'll need to figure out what needs to change, what should we ensure, all of those things. And so we'll get into a conversation about that. I also want to make sure that today we touch on um, not only this application process, because whoever we end up uh, nominating or recommending, rather, will go before the Board of Aldermen for an official vote after we present our recommendation to President Green. Uh, the thing that we'll need to do along the way is just kind of figure out how often we need to meet to figure this whole thing out, right? So give some thought to that. We'll talk about that in just a moment. I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page about the things that we have to accomplish today. And then after that, you know, if any of you have any announcements, we'll consider it and we'll kind of go forward from there. All right. So the first step is creating an open or considering the current nomination process and perhaps creating an open nomination process. Now, are you able to access the current nomination process, the guidelines? Cool. Um, Great. So let's kind of walk through what those guidelines look like, mainly so that we can all be on this wonderful same page. So so for the selection process, well, first of all, let's get into the qualifications. Just want to make sure that we're all on the same page for the qualifications, right? Um, for the St. Louis Poet Laureate, we ask that the poet laureate be at least 21 years of age, have been St. Louis City, and in here it says county resident for at least 3 years prior to the nomination deadline and remain a resident throughout the 2-year term. Uh, be committed to bringing poetry to a wide range of places and people, and be able and available to reach St. Louis audiences through travel or other means. Provide evidence of achievement in the art of poetry, including having a body of publicly accessible works, and be prepared to undertake the public role required of the laureate. Now, in the past, and this is coming from someone who served, I had the pleasure, I didn't really talk too much about myself, but as a poet myself, as someone who had the pleasure of serving on the first Poet Laureate Task Force and then supporting the second Poet Laureate Task Force, uh, we've long considered people outside of the city of St. Louis, but I wonder about the wisdom about that. Part of what we initially hoped, and this is in conversations that I had with Williams, and certainly Williams, if you are out there, if you want to weigh in at some point, certainly you can. But the thing that we had hoped is that this would truly be a regional effort because the city of St. Louis made the effort to create an ordinance to to codify this process and make the poet laureate something that's real and not just an idea, not just something that we name someone, right? But to make it real. And so St. Louis County has an opportunity to do that, but that hasn't manifested as of right now. So right now, it's only been the city of St. Louis that has really put forward this process and put forward this effort. Now, I want to mention that. I wanted to name that as we consider the qualifications for who the next poet laureate should be. And I want to open that up and really the qualifications up for discussion. If anyone has any comments they'd like to share.
MK, with your historical knowledge, has there ever been a poet laureate from outside of the city?
No, not outside of the city. Well, technically, LaFleur would represent that poet. It was an interesting moment. I won't get too deep into it. Actually, two. So Castro initially, that was with the University of City. He lived in University City. He's since transitioned. Um, Although he's very much so been a part of just the whole region. And then LaFleur, and I would say Iber was the first one from the city, I think, while she resided in the city, to be a poet laureate here. And that's a great question, Connor. And I think that's something that we should be mindful about, especially given that the first two had residences outside of the city of St. Louis.
Yeah, I think just in personal opinion, I would love to see someone from the city, someone who resides in the city to represent the St. Louis City Poet Laureate would be my preference. However, I understand that there are certainly qualified people from around the region. I know that we are the St. Louis region as a collective. That's just the city pride in me.
Absolutely. Christine, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, no worries at all. I just wanted to make sure all the committee members knew that the ordinance is pretty just framework related. It doesn't have too much specificity. And these are really dated guidelines and processes. So I think to the extent you're able to update them and make them make sense for today, I would encourage you all to do so.
Thank you so much. Anyone else would like to weigh in specifically on what Connor mentioned regarding this being? Go ahead, Pamela.
Yeah, I agree with Connor in the sense that I would love to see it be a city resident. I wouldn't want it to be an absolute, though, that it must be a city resident, because just with the way our population is, and just thinking about the fact that like Michael Castro, for example, was very involved in the poetry community in the city of St. Louis, even though he didn't reside in the city. So I think there are other factors to weigh. So I live in Tower Grove South. I'm a city resident, so I share your feelings, Connor. I just don't want to make it so strict that we could miss an opportunity to have somebody who really be very dynamic in the role.
Yeah, Pamela, I was actually thinking the same thing when I thought about it not being the absolute because of the reach, right? Having the reach and the engagement in both places could really be beneficial. So, and especially if they are very close to, they live very close in the city, like U City or Clayton or somewhere, and they are deeply engaged, I can see that them being a good candidate.
Thank you, Pam. Thank you, Nick. So, Caitlin, would you like to weigh in?
I don't think I particularly have a preference because again, a lot of the poets I do know are city residents, and we all competed in the circuit together. But some of the greatest poets I've ever worked with have also been from the county. So I don't think it should be an absolute, but I think I don't think it would be fair to just restrict it to only city residents, especially being me because I am a poet from the city. I went to school in the county. I learned about poetry from the county. The poets I met in the county are the ones who gave me access to poetry in the city. So if we could open it up, I think that would be nice. I think it would be more fair.
I hear that. So thank you. So let's give some. So let's. It sounds then that I don't know, Christine. Like, what should we do here? Should we actually start getting to like voting at this point? Is that what we're doing? We're about to make this happen.
I think that's at the discretion of the committee and you as chair, but it
Yeah.
might be helpful for individuals to go through
Mhm.
the qualifications and nomination requirements and come back to the next meeting
Mhm.
with some redlined and edits on what they might like to see. It gives folks time to contemplate. And if you are interested in the possibility of having the poet laureate speak at the mayoral and odd numbered alderpersons swearing in ceremony,
Mhm.
that's April 15th. So you might want to work your way backwards from that date in terms of meeting. It is a bit of a tight timeline. So if you choose to move forward with that, I would suggest you probably meet weekly or every other week.
Yeah. No, I do appreciate that. And I think then for our purposes, we will, if you haven't had a chance to fully consider both the qualifications, and we'll just continue to kind of walk through this a bit and we'll take notes as we go. So we know that that's a sticking point. I don't think anybody has any issues with the poet laureate at least being 21 years of age. I think everything else seems to be fine. It's just a question of whether or not this person is a St. Louis city or county resident. And so we'll underline that and come back to it perhaps at our next meeting, and we'll again determine the meeting cadence, especially after we finish going through the process here. I'll go walking through all the process. So if we go to the next section, which is the nomination requirements.
Hey, MK,
I'm
real
sorry,
quick,
yes,
I have a question for you. Is
sure.
there anything that is required in their responsibilities as the laureate for them to have to be a city resident? So after they've gotten that title, is there anything thereafter that requires them to be a resident of the city?
Yeah, so here's the thing. It's not so much a requirement, but there is a thing. So if you go to the ordinance itself, one of the things that the ordinance speaks to is, make sure I'm looking at it. One moment. One of the things that the ordinance speaks to is the responsibilities of the poet laureate. One of the things under section 1, this is section 1E, officiating special events upon request throughout the term. But prior to that is section 1D, commemorating the city of St. Louis through works that speak to, for, uh and of our region. Now, of course, you can live in St. Louis County and commemorate the city of St. Louis. But there is, I'll be honest, there is something there. To me, there's a
Mhm,
tension there.
mhm,
Like you
mhm,
live in St. Louis County, but you'll commemorate St. Louis City,
mhm,
and assuming that there's a level of choice as to where we choose to live or where we live, I think there's something there. And I think I want to be mindful and sensitive to people who certainly want the process to be open because there are again dynamic poets throughout, but strategically
mhm,
as poetry lovers, we hadn't figured out a way to get both St. Louis City and St. Louis County on the same page with naming a poet laureate. So that's kind of where we are. We're at this place where there were a lot of ambitions, a lot of hopes, but we could not quite get there through the
Yeah.
legislative process.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
Thank you.
sure. Again, it's funny. I don't want to step on any landmines or anything like that, but but I do want to be mindful that actually speaking of history, and thank you for mentioning the historical piece, Connor. Historically, the city of St. Louis has been, I would just say, the first to make certain things happen. So if we think about the St. Louis Art Museum, it was a city art museum, and this was something that was taxpayer funded in the early 20th century, 1907, right? And we wouldn't get to the St. Louis Art Museum until we have the creation of the ZMD, until about 1972. So that means that this was a city-funded activity along with the zoo for decades before the county participated materially in the way that the city had. So we've seen it. We've seen this before, but we also have seen the outcome where both the city and county comes together on an issue of interest to make sure that it is sustainable. It can happen. So I just wanted to acknowledge that. All right. So just I want to continue to like get through this part so that we know exactly what we're going to have to address when we get back together whenever we decide to set that meeting. So just under the nomination requirements, just so that we're all on the same page. The following items are required as a part of each nomination: to complete a nomination form via the online nomination process. The online form will include contact information for the nominator and the nominated poet, including mailing address, phone numbers, and email address. B, if the nomination is not by the poet, a statement verifying that the nominator has been contacted by the nominated poet and that the poet has reviewed the expectations of the position and agrees to the nomination rather, minimum, to the nomination. Next, biographical sketch, resume, or curriculum vitae, not to exceed 1 page, which should include any special honors. Next, the submission should consist of a work sample, not to exceed, published or unpublished, not to exceed 5 pages, and this is for 3 poems. The work sample may be written or audio. If a written work, the sample must include a cover sheet with the name and a list of poetry titles and content. The work sample may contain information that indicates where the poem has been published or performed, or if it has received any awards for merit. The poems should be submitted rather by the poem submitted should be of the highest quality and can be from any time period. The next point, if you submit an audio work sample of up to 3 poems instead of one written one, you may also submit a transcript of the poems performed not to exceed 5 pages, as stated above. A narrative not to exceed 2 pages, while the nominee wishes to be considered what the nominee would hope to accomplish during the 2 years as a St. Louis Poet Laureate. And again, this is just a 2-year term. And the theme to be explored during the initial year of service and ideas for any special projects related to the position. All of what I've written, which is a lot, all of what I've read, rather not written, but all of what I've read because I didn't write this, which is a lot. I want to take a moment here. Is there anything that sticks out to you that we should absolutely address, that we should absolutely change or consider for change as we move forward? Any thoughts?
And for clarity, when we say audio, we're not referring to like a video of them performing the piece or a recording of them performing the piece. Uh, do we just mean, I guess what I'm thinking of is them a record like a them in the studio recording, not a studio, but like a actual just audio, or are we looking for a performance? Could they submit some sort of performance piece that's also video, audio, all that thing?
I think the thought was to make it as accessible as possible.
Okay.
And so if it's by audio, then cool. But to your point, I mean, there are a lot of poets who have their works video recorded. And so if they have a video recording of their work, maybe it's available on YouTube or someplace like that, I think that should be considered as admissible for the nomination process.
Okay.
Yeah. Go ahead, Connor.
Uh, I noticed that one of the requirements is a biographical sketch, resume, or CV.
Mhm.
What is a is that just a phrase I'm not familiar with? What is a biographical? To me, that sounds like you got to draw like a selfie. Like, what is a biographical sketch?
Pam, you want to weigh in?
It's just basically like your bio as a poet, you know. So like it's not like somebody wants to get your whole life story, but they want the biography of somebody as a poet,
Okay,
right?
so
So
that's a poetry specific ask is biographical sketch.
I mean, it wouldn't just be poetry. Other arts would do the same thing.
Okay,
Yeah.
gotcha.
Yeah,
Okay,
so
I just that
essentially
was a
we
new phrase to me, and I didn't know if that was like an older thing that I wasn't familiar with. So that makes sense. Thank you.
So a brief bio, essentially. And we might be able to just update the language so that again, we want to make this as accessible as possible. And if people have any difficulty understanding what biographical sketch might be referring to, we don't need that. We can just make it simpler. All right. Any other questions or comments? Any thoughts?
The only other thing I mentioned here is the asterisk that says that
Oh yeah.
everything has to be in 12-point font with 1-inch margins, blah, blah, blah. That just seems a little silly to me.
Excessive.
Yes, a little over the top.
You know, I know for me, as somebody who's taught people, you bring in that kind of thing so that if it's gonna be typed, that it's not like, because I mean, people will present any kind of thing that's typed. And I remember recently I had a student, it was wonderful that she wanted to submit something that was written, but it was handwritten on a sheet of paper, and she like took like a picture of it. I was like, no, I'm not gonna do that to myself, right? So, but that's the reason why you offer that, because people will they will do it, and so it might seem excessive, but I don't know if I don't know. We can certainly talk about it, but it's just to ensure that people don't run afoul of what we're asking them and offer something that is simply not legible. Any other thoughts? Are we good with the idea of maybe 3 poems? Would 3 poems be enough? I know. 3 poems. Uh, Certainly not to exceed 5 pages. I totally get it. All right.
What if it just was not to exceed 5 pages?
Okay.
Because
Oh,
somebody else, it could be 5 poems, right?
yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point,
Yeah.
especially if we're talking about haikus from Connor. I mean, Connor can't do it, but we're just talking about 3-line poems, tercets. This
So
nigga.
would it be? I still think three is maybe a good minimum, though, right? Just to see a
Sure.
diversity of work. So three minimum, 5 page maximum. Having a minimum number of poems, a maximum number of pages. That
Yeah.
feels maybe like a good
Yes.
compromise there.
I like that. Thank you. Yep, that's excellent. Okay. Any other thoughts before we move on to the next section? So one of the things that we talked about before, and this is under the narrative, the theme to be explored during the initial year of service and ideas for any special projects related to the position. Now, initially, when Castro and actually, when we went through this process and Castro became the inaugural poet laureate, he was able to come up with a theme that was about bridging the divide, right? And this is coming off of the heels of the whole Delmar divide, and so he would eventually have a book published, an anthology featuring a bunch of poets from the region. But it all kind of sparked from this notion of a theme. However, we don't necessarily have to have a theme that needs to be spoken to or a special project per se, but how do we like that as an idea? Do we want to hold on to it? Do we want to dispense with it? What are your thoughts?
Like the idea of it because it creates the legacy and then it kind of anchors you into some sort of centralized movement that the poet is trying to, propel forward or add impact to. And you can kind of look back and say that that person did that. They moved the needle on this topic or this area of concern for the city because of these particular works anchoring to that theme. So I like it, but I don't obviously want to hinder the creative in any way. But I do like that idea.
I I really like the idea of a theme because I also think that I kind of have two conflicting thoughts on it. One is that a theme is not a box. It's not this like rigid thing. It's not as severely limiting as maybe you might think it is. But then on the other hand, I also think that a lot of creativity comes from those restrictions and those bounds and having to fit your creative work into a theme. So I like the idea of a theme because I think it kind of serves to help the creative process while also being broad enough to allow for many different interpretations of it.
Good.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think it's probably important that whoever's going to serve in the position for 2 years has some specific thing that's their own that they're bringing to the table. Like they're bringing their presence, they're bringing their poetry, they're bringing their abilities with an audience, and all that's great. But what makes it distinct to being a laureate as opposed to a poet who's active in the poetry scene in St. Louis is that there's an outreach to the community, right? And so I think for us at least to sort of determine, oh yeah, but I know this person's a good poet, and I think they'd be a good poet laureate. Need to see something about, even if it's not just a theme, but something about, themes or proposed outreach, or whatever it is, but something that lets us see what this person's ideas are for making that broader connection.
Thank you. And I agree. I think there's something that does do the legacy work. I think it does anchor it. And then too, it could be a tie break. I mean, if we have two formidable poets, but one poet's project seems fantastic and doable, versus somebody else who has fantastic work as well, but just maybe not a clear picture of what they would do with the title. I think with that seat, I think that's an important distinction. So we might need it. So okay. All right, so I think perhaps the addition of a video work sample might be useful. Again, in terms of making it accessible, as well as, of course, people can always submit a written form and perhaps maintaining maybe not as particular as the asterisk, but essentially some sort of note that ensures that whatever the poet submits is legible, so that if it does not reach that criterion, if it doesn't address that criterion, then we may be able to dismiss it from consideration, to be honest. So, okay, so that's things to keep in mind. Uh, oh, it's no worries. It's no worries. Thank you for being with us, Nick. I really appreciate it. We're going to move on to how to submit a nomination. And so this is an online, this will be via online. And we would, you see the basic language, but essentially we'll have to come up with um, a deadline for submissions at some point. And to Christine's point, we will work backwards. My goal, just to be candid, is to get the next poet laureate named and up and running during Poetry Month. At some point, that's what I would like to see happen. And I don't know if that's too ambitious, if it seems like to rush, like we're rushing the process. It all depends, I guess, on our ability to create a process to navigate this process and ensure that we have a fair process at that. But I would like to see this happen. And so that means that as we start to think about the deadline, we would be working backwards from that April 15th uh, date. So just kind of keep that in mind. So ineligible nominees, the State of Missouri Poet Laureate or Poets Laureate, which is the plural. Previous St. Louis Poets Laureate. Selection criteria: have a prior record of high quality published or documented work, ability and willingness to conduct the public engagement duties of the office, demonstration of excellence in their artistic work, capacity to foster publication of public appreciation of and participation in poetry through readings, public presentations and or teachings in diverse communities, ability to advance poetry in the St. Louis region as evidenced by an established history of activity in St. Louis's literary community through readings, publications, public presentations, and/or teaching, and agree to conditions in terms of appointments. Any thoughts about the selection criteria? Okay, all right. Anything we might want to add? We don't have to have that to add today, but certainly you could think about it. And when perhaps the next time we meet, we can make this process official as well as other processes official. I think as we roll to the close of this section here, selection process, the St. Louis Poet Laureate Task Force, as seated by President Green, will review all submitted nominations and select at least 3 semifinalists. Each semifinalist will be interviewed in person by the St. Louis Poet Laureate Task Force, which will make a recommendation to President Green. The St. Louis Poet Laureate Task Force will select the St. Louis Poet Laureate subject to approval by President Green and the St. Louis Board of Aldermen. The St. Louis Poet Laureate will be notified when President Green approves the selection to bring before the Board of Aldermen, and then President Green will announce the St. Louis Poet Laureate. So that's what the selection process looks like. That's what it's been. And we've had some wonderful ceremonies in City Hall for each one of our Poets Laureate for the city of St. Louis. Castro, I think was somewhere else, but no, I think Castro was there. Certainly LaFleur and certainly Iber. So it's been um, it's been a really fruitful process of figuring out how to do this. But what are your thoughts about having in-person interviews with the semifinalists?
Yeah, MK, I actually was going to ask you what any feedback you had on that process, on the kind of the hits, misses, and wishes of what we could have done differently. Because I do like the idea of these in-person interviews, but also want to make sure it's accessible and equitable and all those things. So what any feedback you have?
It was very useful for the last process to be able to hear from the candidates. That I will say that it held a lot of influence over the deliberations, over how they discussed it. There was something about seeing the poet on page. And then again, we're talking about, poets who may have a reputation, who've been active in the community for a long time and even had works published. But sitting with the poet in those moments was very useful for them. And I think that's something that we need to think about. The poet might be great on page or even on video or audio, but it's that interaction that we may also want to consider, especially because they'll be an ambassador, for poetry, for literature, for letters, for the city and for the region. So I think it's useful. So if if they're able to join us for in person, now we can obviously make an accommodation if they cannot, right? But I think having an interview process for the finalists to determine who will be the next poet laureate feels appropriate as opposed to doing it somewhat cold by just looking at the works that might be available.
And you thought the one was sufficient, the one interview?
Yeah, well, for them it was sufficient for them. They saw a clear they saw something clear in their interview, and that helped them. I think for us, we can, because we're talking about three semifinalists. We could consider holding or holding space for a second interview if necessary. If necessary. And maybe if that's the case, then maybe the first interview could just be virtual. Second interview could then be in person, you know. That way we're not necessarily tying up everyone's schedule to do two interviews. But I do take your point. I think more interaction is better than less. And this is effectively the work of the task force to get this right, you know. So
Right. And especially, and I'm thinking about the length of time, it being the 2 years, I want to be sure that they understand what the tall order that we're asking of them through this commitment by showing our commitment to get it right. So,
I agree with that. Any other thoughts? Because Nick is upping our activity here. Any thoughts? Or are we pretty much good with maybe this two interview? So then essentially three, that'll whittle us down to two. And then after that, we all meet to have a final conversation, and then that's our recommendation. Does that sound fair? Okay. And would it be okay if we had potentially, depending on the person's access to, let's say, reliable, internet, right? Sometimes things can be spotty because of weather or whatever the case may be. Are we okay with initially doing an interview via virtual and then to do the follow-up interview in person, and then we maybe have our conversation after that interview? Okay. Okay. Excellent. Okay. Oh, go ahead, Christine.
Thanks. I'm just taking notes for the committee, so I want to make sure I'm keeping track of everything. So for each individual candidate, you're planning on having a virtual interview first and then a follow-up in person for the nominees, the three.
For the three semifinalists. That's right.
Okay, great. Thank you.
No problem. Thank you. All right. We're getting there. Thank you all. Expectations of the position. The St. Louis Poet Laureate is expected to celebrate the written and spoken poetic voices of St. Louis residents by using the appointment as a platform from which to illuminate not only his, her, or their own work, but also the work of other writers in the St. Louis region, contribute to the growth, access, and awareness of poetry throughout St. Louis, encourage both the reading and writing of literature, use the art of poetry to enlighten, educate, entertain, transform, and inspire, establish and emerging generations of literary artists and readers of literature, participate in at least four. This is the actual deliverable here, right? Participate in at least four literary events and four educational programs in schools in the region. Promote poetry and St. Louis Poet Laureate position via official social media accounts. Prepare and provide a written report of activities every 6 months to the St. Louis Poet Laureate Task Force. Create a substantial new work commemorating the city of St. Louis through works that speak to, for, and of our region. Collaborate with other city and state poets laureate, including the St. Louis Youth Poet Laureate and the state poet laureate when possible. Yep. So, any thoughts here?
the participate in the four literary events, are those events that exist today, or they will be responsible for coming at what that looks like?
I think it could be both and. Certainly, we have a lot of literary arts organizations in the city. I think the idea is that once you're named, that you need to be in the community. And so whatever that might be. So let's say if it's school based, maybe at a college or university, maybe it's an organization of some kind. Uh, Nick, you mentioned legacy, right?
Mm.
Legacy in its once long held popular Friday night open mic, right? That would be one of those things. It could be something like that. So something that I think is community based, I think is the idea there. And then the four educational programs, again, it's something that is of the community for the people and for perhaps young people at that, so that this person can demonstrate what it looks like to be not only the poet laureate, but in community.
Mm-hmm. Got it.
Yeah. Any
Well,
other?
all of them so good.
Okay, okay. Any other thoughts, anybody? Well, I think we have quite a bit that we agree with so far. I think the thing that we'll need to mull over and consider is the city county question as it relates to eligibility for the poet. Again, we've had some wonderful poets laureate to grace the position. Of the first three, and we've only had three, two of which lived outside of the city, but very much so identified with and participated in activities in the city. However, uh, w- this is something that the city yet again has taken the first step on, and this could be, perhaps a part of a larger conversation that we need to have about the poet laureate for the region, but we don't have to have that conversation today. I just want to acknowledge that that's kind of where we are with the process. All right. So I think that is essentially it. So let's figure out a meeting cadence. The more often we meet, I feel the more quickly we'll get this done. But I don't know that, but I think that is a possibility. So it could be certainly, it could be weekly, or we can take some time to kind of mull things over and meet every 2 weeks. But the bottom line to it, my hope is that we can quickly finalize this process, open up the process, publicize the opportunity, get applications in, shut down the process, review the applications, name our three finalists, interview our three finalists, get down to two finalists, right? And then recommend who the next poet laureate would be. That will be my hope so that this person can participate in the swearing in activities in April. That is my hope. And how cool would that be for a poet to participate on a stage like that with such political heavyweights in our city? That would be great. Just where the poet laureate should be. So
With that in mind, I don't see how we cannot meet weekly, with that, all that going on. I mean, even just standing up the process and then opening up the nominations, it's gonna take a little bit to get that in, so,
I, I know. That sounds about right, Nick. Thank
yeah.
you. Thank you. That's so true. But do your schedules allow? Yeah, that's the question. I mean, life happens and life happens quick. So, if there are things that you think might prevent you from keeping up a pace that will allow us to get this done, really by March, um, let me know. Any thoughts? It's a sprint. I mean, it's like a long distance sprint. It's like, is it 400 meters? This is that's a tough run to run. I mean, it's a tough one. So if anybody has any concerns, I definitely want to allow us. I want to allow space for that. And it's no judgment. But if we can meet weekly, if that makes sense also to you, Christine, I would love to get it done so that we can get this process underway and get this person named.
It
Good.
likely works for me as long as I know ahead of time to make sure I can add it to my
Okay. Okay.
schedule.
That sounds fair, fair and reasonable. Pam?
Yeah, do we have a time that would be set up every week that we're thinking of?
I think at this time, we might, if we're thinking about weekly, what we may need to do offline is kind of hammer down what that time might need to
Okay.
be through a series of emails, and Christine can facilitate that process to ensure that that one, what we agreed to is publicly available to anybody who wants to sit in on these meetings, and if necessary, add their voice. So I would imagine that's the process, right, Christine?
We can do that. I mean, I guess I'm curious if this time and day of the week is typically convenient for people or if it's not. If it is, we could just continue to schedule.
I'd need it to be later on a Monday. I normally wouldn't be able to meet before 4.
Yeah.
Same for me.
Yeah,
So,
I would prefer after 4. My schedule is varied and complicated from day to day and week to week, and so I will just have to do my darndest to make it all work.
absolutely. So then, are we thinking? I guess the earliest would be 4 o'clock, but potentially 4:30 or even 5 o'clock. Is that kind of what we're thinking about? What's possible here? What are your
Yeah, I mean,
thoughts?
like 4:35, any of those times on a Monday would be fine. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, same for me.
Any thoughts for you, Christine?
If it's possible to do 4, that would be helpful. The first and second Mondays of the month, I have a meeting at 6 o'clock.
Right, right. And then next week is the King holiday. It's the King holiday. So we would really need to hit the ground running if we're not m- meeting on the King holiday. That seems inappropriate to meet on the King holiday. So, I mean, it's funny because I work on the King holiday, like just in community. So it's never really a day off. But I get it. I totally get it. So, that said, uh, if we can commit to Mondays with taking the King holiday to reflect, to gather our strength and get ready, and then really hit the ground running the Monday thereafter. At that meeting, we would need to solidify our process because we would already have our cadence, and then create a deadline for submissions and then go forward from there. Because essentially, after that meeting, we should be opening up the process. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
All right. Any thoughts from you, Christine?
Nope, I will notice a meeting for the next handful of Mondays at 4 o'clock. And I think all of you have my email. If there's anything I can be doing to be helpful to support your work between now and the next meeting, please let me know.
Excellent. All right. Well, actually, we're at a point now where, if I'm not mistaken, we can open this up for any announcements from our task force members. All right. Kaylin, you have a production coming up, don't you? Just throw you on the spot, bro.
Yeah, I do. I'm in a production at the Black Rep right now. We actually already started, but it's running until the 26th. I want to say at the Edison Theater in Washi. So
Okay.
that's very cool.
It is very cool. So this is a person who has a theater background from her high school and went on to join a slam poetry team and win a couple of national championships as a youth poet. It's incredible. So I always want to like trumpet that because that's big. And how old are you again, Kaylin? Just
22.
yep, 2022. So there you go. All right. If there are no other announcements, I'm going to move us to adjournment. Is there anything I'm missing, Christine? Good deal. So what Christine will do is give us these notes, and that will be the basis on our decision making for the next time we meet after the King holiday, and then we're running from there. Okay. All right. Well, if there's no other notes, I do want to bring this meeting to a close. The meeting of the Poet Laureate Task Force is now adjourned. Thank you very much for being here.